Welcome back to the Mannin Line. With me is Peter Kelly, MBE, from the Isle of Man Victorian Society. And before we went to the news, we'd been talking about a number of things that were in the past, how the tourist industry had developed. And it's interesting enough, the numbers of the tourist industry, the arrivals, that's what started us off, because there's a bit of a debate and a dispute going on at the moment as to whether the published figures are right or not. And in the past, how did they get the figures together in the past, Peter? Well, I mean, what did they use to assess it in days gone by?
I don't know. You probably remember, the same as me, the Isle of Man Examiner Annual, which came out when it was full of details of presidents, chairmen, etc., of clubs and societies, but there was sort of an official section. And there, every year, right up to the 70s, they were publishing the figures from, well, before 1914, about 1899 or something, were published. And, of course, when they started, there was no air arrivals, so it was a simple matter of at the boat. But whether the steam packet supplied figures or whether it was the harbour board that did account, but I can't see that it would be totally accurate.
Wasn't there some sort of minor tax on all arrivals? Wasn't some money paid?
Well, that's right. The steam packet, they paid 7 and 6, I think, was a landing fee per person. So I suppose they were relying on that information. And as I said in the first half, if you came in on a day trip, or even if you went on a day trip and came back, you were an arrival. So even in those days, the figures were distorted in the sense that they weren't true visitors or tourists.
But I can remember from my young days that there was a concern every year about arrivals up or down, particularly down. There was the tourist board. I'm too young to remember the June Effort Committee from which the tourist board came and stemmed from.
That's right. There were local shopkeepers and business people who made a donation each year to the June Effort. And the early Douglas carnivals were actually in June, not August. It was part of the idea of getting people to come here virtually out of season in June. The season was July and August principally. And of course you had, before the tourist board, the publicity board, and before that I mentioned about the steam packet did a lot of the advertising on railway stations. But you then had hoteliers who got together and contributed, and they produced the first guidebooks. Guidebooks in the sense of list of accommodation, where they took out advertisements, and that, of course, ended up as the tourist board guide. But yeah, it was the entrepreneurial efforts of individuals. Mr. Kegg, who ran the Sefton, he was, in fact, I think he was the first secretary of the group that promoted through that way, right off and get your brochure with all this list of accommodation.
What were they selling? In the sense that they had Blackpool on the doorstep, mainly for Lancashire people, and in those days Fleetwood had something going for it, and North Wales as well. So yeah. What did they sell to make? I remember a campaign that said "Go abroad to the Isle of Man,"
or "Come abroad to the Isle of Man." Yeah. Yes, well, that came in the 30s, and that was the principal difference between us and Blackpool and Morecambe and the other resorts, the playground of Lancashire, was the fact that you had the sea journey. And when you look at old postcards, of which I have many, in writing back home, arrive safely, only seasick twice, digs good, going to Kirkbraden tomorrow, and see you on Saturday. Yes, it was that difference. And of course, if you're in one of the mill towns, where are you going for holidays? Blackpool, well, we're going to Isle of Man. It was a little bit of one-upmanship as well. And then what was here for them was similar in many respects, of theatres, music halls, etc. And whilst today people would say, White City or the Onken Head, the title was actually Onken Head, the White City of the Isle of Man, and later it just became known as White City. The fun fair there, I was in correspondence with an expert many years ago, and I provided him with a list of the type of entertainments that were there that was taken from the rate book at Onken Commissioners, and things called the Woomph and things like that. And he replied, he said he was really absolutely astounded, because what we had at Onken was a head of Blackpool, in what became the Blackpool Pleasure Beat, we had these individual things first, and then Blackpool copied. So yeah, we were ahead of the game.
People were prepared to take a risk by the sound of it too.
Yeah.
Now, we've got quite a few texts and emails come on. We'll carry on because there's some other things we need to talk about, but let's just have a look at our contributors first of all. Now, we obviously started the other programme with a long item about the health service and some of the changes, and that we would expect we get some reaction to that. One here from Roger, or Wilfred, who says, could you please ask for more details about the current Nobles Hospital management restructuring? Well, Roger, thank you. We'll pass that on. Catherine has, I think, got that on her list. However, of course, I can't put it to the Minister today because he's not here. That was recorded, that interview with Catherine. But we take note of that. Now we've got another one that says, if people are exempt from prescription charges, it should only be for their long-term illnesses, not for all medications. That's one comment we have. Another one says prescriptions could be free if people on £41,000 or more per year paid 11% NI as the lower paid do. At the moment they only pay 2%. That is just not fair. The poor and sick are propping up government's rich friends. Right, well, that's another comment. Can you please ask the Minister for... well, I can't do it today, I'm afraid, but Derek, but can you please ask the Minister for clarification regarding the supply of incontinence products, please? Right, well, we pass that on as well. And the facility for UDA clawback, this is, of course, to the dentist thing, it already exists in the contract. The department has simply chosen not to enforce it. They actually wrote off the clawback. This is external operations and things as well. They wrote off the clawback debts amounting to hundreds of thousands of pounds in return for practices taking patients off a waiting list, even though the contract has nothing in it regarding patient numbers or patient registration. Regarding off-island treatment, I know of one patient being sent to the UK for dental implants when this is a treatment available on the island. And then, if you want to kill NHS dentistry, just vary the way the UDAs are paid. The only other way is a fee per item, which was kicked out in 2006. The department is trying to get patient numbers under control as the UDA system has no regard for patient numbers. Regards, and this is from an interested dentist. Also, in relation to my text about, this is the same gentleman, about UDA clawback, dentists don't get paid on the basis on patient numbers. Only UDAs, so writing off clawback in return for taking extra patients. It's wrong and makes no financial sense. The dentist should note that their clawback and be made to take more patients so that they can achieve their UDAs in the future. So that's an interesting thing with the dentist, that is a system that probably sounds of it's not working. But we did talk about dentistry in the last interview and on our previous programme, and I think that's so there's some changes and some things due to happen there, I believe. If the figures were up, this is now talking back to tourists again, if the figures are up, we would be blowing our trumpet. But now they're down, we don't believe them, says Peter. Well, I suppose that was always the case. But as you say, it's the way that they're gathered and assessed, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think you'd find it strange that two government departments can be at loggerheads with each other, though.
It's not the first time, I don't think so. But I thought we passed a bill recently sort of to make all government departments one, so if you they weren't suing one another because they were all part of the same thing. But anyway, that's another
well, I don't think they got round to finishing that yet, have they?
Oh, right, I don't know.
This is a single entity government.
Yeah.
Saying, yes, it was rather ridiculous, wasn't it, that one department sued another for a default using public money, and the other one defended itself using public money.
Yeah.
And then if it was found in default, it paid the fine with public money.
Yeah.
Bit potty. You are interested, obviously, Peter, in this business where we have registration of properties. We have a system which a property comes under some sort of protection, as it were, by registration. How does that system work?
Well, loosely, it's based on listed buildings in the UK. But when they brought it in here, they decided not to call it listing. They decided to call it registering. It's a bit like the Tourist Board slogan, "It's our differences that make the difference." Mm-hmm. Well, I used to misquote that. It's our differences that make the difficulties. In the UK, with listing, you have Grade 1, Grade 2 star, and Grade 2. And Grade 1, if you're Grade 1, you have to make your house available or property for the public to visit, but you're entitled to certain grants which you don't get with the others. When they brought in registration here, it was across the board. You were either registered or you weren't, so there was no grading, and there are talks now bringing in grading, which would just be a total waste of time and energy in doing, in my opinion. So if you're registered, it doesn't condemn you to, that's it, your building is in Aspic. You can change it. It just means that when you apply for planning permission, you also have to apply for registered building permission, which is meant to be the safeguard. In other words, it may be all right to put this extension on your house because it blends in, but in terms of registration, are you then in some way spoiling the original building by virtue of adding on something 2/3 the size and putting it out of proportion? They started off, this was when Marlene Hendy was appointed, and a lot of buildings became registered. There's still a lot on a list to be looked at, and in fact there are buildings that aren't even on that list that should be looked at. When Marlene moved on from being the conservation officer, a new one was appointed, and in fact there was a deputy. Now their role, apart from deciding what should go forward to the planning committee or to the department to be registered, was also to give advice, and there was also the element of grants. If you lived in a conservation area, you could receive a grant up to 50% for even redecoration. Well, when we were hit with you're not getting so much back for your VAT, and all this extra money that was floating around disappeared, then over a very short period of time, the grants, whilst the system is still there, there is no money. So anybody in a registered building or conservation area, it's useless going saying, look, I need assistance to re-roof to keep it looking like it was, etc. Equally, the assistant conservation officer post disappeared, and then in December of last year, the conservation officer, who had become part-time because he had this incredible other job in government. He was seconded. So on one hand, he was allegedly or supposedly protecting buildings, and on the other, he was part of the redevelopment scheme, which would involve the demolition.
A conflict of interest somewhere.
Absolute conflict. Anyway, the officer has gone, and the post has gone because they re-advertised over Christmas for not a conservation officer, but a registered building officer.
What's the difference?
Well, that we will find out when he starts. I think the idea is to concentrate on going through this list of buildings that are potential registered buildings, doing the research, putting them forward, etc. Won't be there, I don't think, to give advice when you go in and say, I want to change the windows in my house and I'm in a conservation area, what do I do? I don't think that backup...
So where does that come from then, to a person who perhaps does need to change their windows and doesn't know how to go about it?
Well, this is the big problem, that the education of the public and the advice to the public is quite obviously missing. And I have looked at planning applications of recent and thought, where they got their advice from, or have they got any advice? They want to do this, they want to do that.
But wouldn't an architect fill that gap?
Yeah, but particularly with window applications, they go off to Fred Jones and Co., who does windows, and the applications quite often. And what you'll get is the form filled in. You'll get a photograph of the house as it is, and you'll get a brochure. And it's a case, well, that's what we're going to do. There's a lack there. And what is worrying on some occasions, where on the form it says, have you spoken with the planning officer? If so, who? And it says yes, and it gives a name. And then you think, well, in what way? Have they spoken to a planning officer who says, yes, you need approval? Or has the planning officer said, well, this is what you should be looking at? I don't know.
Okay. But isn't there a danger in this as well, that buildings that do need to be registered will then get registered a bit late? after maybe they've been knocked about a bit.
Oh, well, classic case, of course, came again beginning of the year. In December, I think it was, no, before December, the Isle of Man Bank ripped the guts out of their head office in Athol Street, which many people are aware of. And they did actually put in a planning application to do it. And included in the planning application was new signage outside and the ramp on Prospect Hill, a very gentle ramp, aluminium, for disabled access. Now, somebody in the planning office decided, because the building wasn't registered, oh, well, the internal works, that's not planning. So all that was put on the advertised list, which of course is no longer advertised in the paper, was the ramp and the signs, and nothing about the interior alterations.
So that's just up to the owner, is it?
Yeah, well, but the bank had gone to the trouble of submitting plans showing it, but the department didn't let the public know it was happening, and then it happened.
And then
now, come January, the department, I think it's had its arm twisted a bit, have put forward the bank for registration.
The horse has bolted.
Well, the horse has bolted, and what's more, even in putting it forward, it drew a red line round the plan and described it as 2 Athol Street, whereas it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 and 14. But that included the modern extension that was put on the bank in shiny black marble. And you may have noticed that they subsequently re-advertised the whole thing, still as 2 Athol Street, and the only difference was they've taken the modern bit off the plan. So it's they're in array there, really.
Well, this is one in particular issue, but there must be properties, quite a lot of properties around Douglas, who are not quite so splendid as the bank, who perhaps have some historic value or they have some architectural value. But there is a problem, isn't it, with people when you own a property and it might be registered. You can't then afford to keep it going.
Well, you could if the grant system was there, but it's not. And of course, you'll get politicians say, "Oh, well, there is a grant system." Well, there is, but if there's no money, there isn't. It may be there on
keeping
paper.
it going though. There's in today's world, sometimes a building that was built in 1830, which might be an interesting building, has no real practical use.
Well, this is where alternative use comes in. I mean, I get quite annoyed when somebody said it reached the end of its usefulness and what have you. It's reached the end of its usefulness as or for that purpose for which it was built. And, I mean, a building you're familiar with in Derby Road, built as the Methodist New Connection Church, and that was in the 1890s. By 1914, it was bought by St Thomas's Church and became St Thomas's Church Hall. Then they put an extension, a modern extension to it, and in the 1970s, late 70s, they sold off the original building that had started life as a Methodist church, and they sold it to the Red Cross, who converted it to a Red Cross headquarters. Then it's moved on to the youth band, and it's now a band practice room. But it's still the same building, so it's not that it's not fit for a chapel or no longer needed demolish. You can actually apply
It's had extra floors put in and all sorts now. But
it's had an extra floor put in by the Red Cross.
Right, we have 1 or 2 more texts and emails here now. All those receiving a subsidised public sector pension should be made to pay full price for medication, bus fares, etc. No more subsidies for these people. This is this issue, of course, about what public service pensions are costing us again. Roger, this is an excellent programme, as ever when Peter Kelly is a guest. Right, there we are, Peter, don't blush.
That wasn't from Mrs. Kelly, was it? No, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be.
It was from a Chris. Right. One factor that I feel is often not mentioned when comparing the Isle of Man to other tourist destinations is that the Isle of Man had all-day pub licensing hours, whereby Blackpool and others would need to comply with English licensing laws, with pubs forced to close in the afternoon. The laws were only relaxed in England as late as the mid-1980s.
Well, they weren't all day here all the time, and in actual fact, if you read the newspapers from Victorian times, to get a licence was not easy, because you had a very great teetotal movement on the island. Philip Christian, the owner of Finch Hill Estate, he was the president, and virtually every new application for a licence was opposed by the teetotalers or the Rechabites or whatever. And it was a hard job to get a licence. And then you had a situation with Derby Castle, which was in Onken. And they had more flexibility in their hours. And there were comic postcards of people running along the prom at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock or whatever to get to the Derby Castle.
So this was interpretation of the local licensing code
Yeah,
then?
yeah. So that they could continue to drink, and that was over the back. And then, of course, they extended the Douglas boundary, and that put paid to that. So.
Yes. Well, we're talking about difficulties with buildings that we were talking about before, though. There comes a time, doesn't there, when maybe the building even can't be repaired or renovated. I know, for instance, of the example is the Mannin Hotel, where it was intended with the best will in the world to keep the original outside and change the inside. Turns out that it was in such a bad condition it wouldn't do it. So the hotel you've got there now is a modern replica.
Yeah, and a fairly good one. It's unfortunate that when they put the plans in, which was to retain the facade, and I would say it could have been done if the steelwork was dropped in, but economy comes into this. The original scheme including dropping one of the hotels and putting this glass entrance, which let light into the atrium. Certainly by taking one out in a row, it's like taking a domino out in a thing. It weakens the others. And to my mind, it was rather a pity, and others visiting the island from the UK have said that they should have put the terrace back entirely as it was, but without the glass bit. The glass bit lets it down at the moment. But yeah, it wasn't the first application where people have said we're going to retain this and do this and do that, and then our engineer says, but you'd have thought the engineer would have said it.
Sometimes you can't tell till you get digging in, though, can you?
In the first place. But no, the Mannin was running with water, and on some occasions you sort of get defects or whatever by default. Leave a few windows open and
you're implying something intentional there, but
yeah.
And that happened to a degree with the old Palace Ballroom, didn't it?
Yes.
Right. Anyway, let's take our first caller now, and it's Vivian on the line. Good afternoon to you, Vivian.
Hello, Roger. Hello, Peter. I have concerns about some of these churches and chapels. I hope you've both seen this Kelly Brothers Kurt Michael book, where all the photographs of all the work done on churches and chapels, and a lot of them now are hoping to tear them apart. And I know of one building that is registered, but the inside of it is not registered, and I think it's criminal because all they're going to do is empty it and put ordinary chairs in, and we're losing woodwork that I don't think can ever be replaced. I don't know what Peter thinks about it.
Well, hello. I just missed the very beginning because the sound wasn't turned up on my earphones, but that doesn't matter. Yes, I've got the book, and in fact I supplied some of the photographs for it. I do share your concern. There is this thing about churches now, they must be multifunctional. A classic case in Onken, St. Peter's, where all the pews have been removed and they got chairs. That's so it can be flexible. We can have coffee mornings, we can have Christmas fairs. Yet they've got in fact they've got the best church hall in the island, the Bailey Scott one.
Yeah.
Then there was, with Onken, there was a fear that the screen, root screen, which was put in 1933 by Kelly Brothers, was going to go. Hopefully it's not going to go. It's in the book. But yes, you said about those that are registered, but the interior isn't. Now, it's interesting because if you speak to the planners now, they'll try and convince you that the interior is included.
Well,
but
that is very interesting because one building that I'm talking about, they are hoping or thinking they're going to take the inside completely out of this chapel. And I think it's a crying shame.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. In the early buildings that were registered, if anything in the interior or the total interior was to be included, it had to be listed in the original registration document. So the Majestic, when it was registered for about 2 months, listed certain things in the garden, steps and flower pots and all sorts of things, and a couple of things on the interior. Whereas now, as I say, that they're applying sort of English rules and saying it's all registered. But yes, I'm aware of a church that's registered in the south of the island where things have happened, and they haven't happened with a registered building application, and in a way that they're fairly major. If you've got a building that's such as a church, it's registered for a reason. And where you've got a very old church, everything about it has got to be important. So to start taking out pulpits and altering church altar rails and things is taking away the whole purpose of being registered.
I'm going to interrupt you, pair of you here now, because we've run a bit over on the slot for an advert break. So, Vivian, thank you for joining us on the programme today, and thank you for making those comments.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Welcome back to the last part of today's Mannin Line. With me in the studio is Peter Kelly from the Isle of Man Victorian Society. And we've been getting a mixed bag, really, of reactions to both Victoriana and to the health services item which was on the Sunday Opinion programme earlier. But Peter, I've got one here. I noticed that the horse tram depot at the far end of the prom is soon to be demolished in favour of a more modern replacement. Well, that was built in about 1902, wasn't it?
Yep, by the corporation. Yes, I've looked at those plans, and in fact, I'm very happy with them. Basically, they're removing the 1935 or whatever it was first floor extension, and they're demolishing everything that's there, but they're rebuilding it so that the frontage replicates what was put up in 1902, which obviously is not as high as what it became, and it's very well done. And I fully support that.
But this shows you sometimes that a building, despite the fact you talked about reuse, there comes a time when they can't be. They're worn out.
Yeah, well, those horse tram depot, where they kept the trams, not the horses, at the back was just a corrugated iron shed. I mean, it was of no consequence at all and not seen. There are photographs showing the steel work, and no doubt it could have been repaired, but at great expense. But when they're putting it back, a bit like the Mannin Hotel, that it looks like it was, then in my book, that's okay.
Yes, and fit for today's purpose too. Yeah. Right. Well, we've had a email here in from Michael Starkey, and he says, is there anything in the plans to save the old booking office and stables? There's some wonderful stained glass in this, or will it end up in a skip?
Right, well, of course, the stables is a different issue. The building at Strathallan has 1930s sort of Art Deco glass. It's rather strange because it's not even a half circle. It's part of a half circle because it stops short to put a letterbox in. On the plans, it refers to that stained glass, and there's very little 30s glass left. Some of the hotels in Port Erin had it. And it says stained glass to be carefully removed and stored for future use. Now, it doesn't say where, and I don't suppose those involved know at this stage where it would or could be used. I do remember down in Castletown, I don't know whether you remember old Bill's the Barber's. It featured in that Island at War series, but it was a shop in Castletown which was a barber shop, and it had fluted columns on the front. It was a planning application to rebuild, and it said to be all this wooden frontage to be carefully taken down, and it even went into description how it was to be attached to sheets of plywood and then stored and then reused. Well, I don't know where it was stored, and it certainly wasn't reused. So, yeah, I'm never fully taken in with that story, I'm afraid.
Yes, but if it's, that might have been a private concern, of course, but if it's a government department with these restrictions put on it, they should do it, really, shouldn't they?
Yes, should, but government departments are not the world's best looking after things.
Right now, Kit Gorn says that Peter is right that the recordings of the number of visitors arriving in the Isle of Man was very important. This was because the 1890 Common Purse arrangement, by which the Isle of Man and the UK shared their customs duties, generally favoured the Isle of Man economically. The Common Purse arrangement formula was based on a residential and visiting population, so the higher the number of visitors meant that the Isle of Man got a higher share of the Common Purse. The formula remained largely the same up until 2007, when everything changed with the new VAT arrangement, and the rest is history.
Thank you.
Okay, yes, because it became the Customs and Excise Agreement after the
Yeah.
Common Purse, of course. That was there was a lot of argument about the Common Purse, wasn't there? Hi all, the depot is an 1896 construction. Happy to see the plans though. That's from Jimbo. So 1896.
Well, 1896 is when the big canopy was put up, and it was also the same time that the tramway company took over Strathallan Lodge and turned it into the Strathallan Hotel. Certainly reference books, but I've not followed it up, do refer to 1902 for the car shed. The previous car sheds were at the bottom of Summer Hill, in front of what's now the Kay Memorial Gardens. They were wooden buildings, which during the daytime the trams ran through, it sort of like a tunnel, and then at night they were stockpiled inside there. And when that was taken down, which was 1896, I think as well, it was bought by Fred Callow, the builder, and it moved its way up to Palatine Road and became his builder's workshop.
Now, I've got an interesting email here from John Cruz. He says, hello both, the proposed new horse stables are subject to an appeal against it. It's someone from Heron and Brealey's lodging the appeal in the Terminus Tavern.
Yeah, separate application. There was a planning application to build temporary stables cum tram sheds, a long, if I say corrugated iron building, preformed metal, running along the length of the Summerland site, and yes, that is subject to appeal. But now that this other application, if it goes ahead, and I hope it does, it is a permanent home for the horse trams. The horses, of course, this year still will be where they've always been, at the bottom of Summer Hill. So that's actually a building that's been put forward, or a complex of buildings that's been put forward for registration.
Right. Now, this takes us, I suppose, to the last comment, because we've almost run out of time here now, Peter. We look at the various Victoriana around the island. You look at the railways, you look at all the similar things to this, including your camera obscura, and people do clearly come to the Isle of Man for railway holidays. This is a very important factor in the tourist industry. But what about all the other things? Do we value them? Do we actually look after them?
I suppose the short answer is no. So many things have disappeared over the years, usually for good reasons, and I mean not the best reasons. The Second World War saw off a lot of things, the Marine Drive, the double-decker tramways, etc., because you had a 6-year period where there was no maintenance. Groudle Glen went greatly down the pan during the Second World War, although after the war it restarted. It wasn't long before the engines were needing replacement. The Glen had not been kept in good nick, etc. So I suppose the short answer to your question is no, we don't value them. People from the other side do, and there's a lot of people here just cannot see that anything is important.
Well, that's interesting, because as a final shot, as we're nearly out of time, Peter has sent us a namesake of yours, says, not all of us want to pay through the nose to live in a museum visited by the very few. This obsession with Victoriana is unhealthy and doesn't relate to our economy.
If you don't look back, you won't look forward.
But what about keeping the assets? I think that's what he's saying. It's not worth spending the money on them.
Well, I would disagree. I mean, you look in the UK, why do people go to Cornwall? Why do they go to Chester? Why do they go to York? It's not because they got rid of everything. It's because they have cherished it.
Peter, well, thank you for coming along and being our guest on both Sunday Opinion and the Mannin Line today. That's Peter Kelly, MBE, who's from the Isle of Man Victorian Society. Catherine Nichol was on the switch today, And I'm Roger Watterson, and Catherine and I will be back at the same time next week. Until then, from all of us, goodbye.